Morning, Alison.
Morning. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited about this conversation. It could go anywhere.
Yes, same.
What came to your mind when you first heard the question?
So it's a really interesting one because the first thing I did is I actually wanted to do a little bit of research around understanding how easy or difficult it is nowadays for women to progress into leadership positions. So, if it's okay with you, I'm going to start off with some stats that I
Yeah,
picked
brilliant.
up.
Yeah.
So one of the things that really struck me is that in 2023, only 37% of women were hired into leadership positions. And there's a decline that's been happening over the last 2 or 3 years, especially. And it's not just in the UK, it's in Europe as well. So what I did is it's part of a broader trend, but nobody seems to know where that originated, which is interesting in itself. So then what I did is I picked up a few other stats and saw that women in parliament, for example, that's a trend that's been increasing right since the 50s. So there are
Wow.
more and more women in parliament in leadership positions year on year. So it led me to wonder whether this was industry specific or is this part of a kind of really broad trend? Um, so then I started looking up some of the stats around organizations, and that did not paint a really positive picture in terms of women in leadership. So only 11% of FTSE 100 and 4% of FTSE 250 women are in senior exec and leadership positions. And that 4%, I think, I don't know about you, but that was quite a hard stat to take.
That's stark. So
Yeah, it
stark.
is.
And I'm
Yeah,
putting in the contrast of looking in like UK society, females make up 51% of our communities. And so when you look at that, you put that comparison there. So we've got 51% in our communities in the UK, and obviously these are worldwide, but you've done your
yeah,
UK, Europe, and then that dropped
yeah.
to 37%, and then 11, and then 4. Oh my word, shocking.
It's not great. It's not great. So in answer to the question that you posed, like what came to mind, I think it helped me to really understand that there's quite a lot of context to this, and that the responsibility for in the way I see it is very much split between us as potential leaders and the organizations that we choose to work alongside and contribute to. Um, there was a few other interesting things that came up. So when I looked at Australia, for example, which I know sounds a little bit random, they're actually in an even worse position than the UK, where they are underrepresented right the way across management and leadership. That's not the case for the UK. With the UK, it's mainly leadership. There's much more of an even balance around management. So it just, I suppose, led me to really get curious about what we can do as individuals and what organizations can do to really try and redress the balance. And I'm sure that you've got some ideas on that as well, Kerry, which I'd love to hear if there's anything that's come up from your research as a result of that.
I guess where I'd got to, because we both got the question, didn't we? We both probably approach it in
Yeah,
totally different ways, which is the beauty of these debates. I suppose where I started was a bit about thinking about what is leadership a little bit. So I probably started on a different angle than you, and probably will converge in the same place eventually.
yeah,
But I was kind of struck by we often associate leadership with hierarchy and position. And I guess I was thinking about where my innate beliefs come from. And I suppose I was thinking, for me, leadership isn't about the position or the hierarchy. It's about what people bring and having followers. You're not a leader unless you've got followers. And for
yeah,
me, leadership's about growing other leaders. So I was starting to think about actually. I mean, the work that we do in professional development, we are very much talking about leadership positions in business. So, of
Yeah.
course, my thinking is going to get there. But it got me thinking about should this debate and should our starting point be thinking about where do we cultivate leadership right across our communities in that way. And so it got me, I went down a different route at looking at the research, which was thinking about the stuff that we perhaps don't notice and thinking
Mm.
about stories that get shared with me. Because part of me was going, I'm having delivered on our Women in Leadership program. Often I'm struck by some of our delegates that go, but isn't leadership regardless of gender? And I'm kind of like, oh, I like that. It really is. And actually, are we really talking about leadership or are we talking about the environment? Is that what we're talking about? So it kind of got me really intrigued. And I've gone down lots of different avenues. But I've been struck by the stats like you, but from a different angle. So I was looking at stuff like really random about how young women, young girls, get into outdoor activity and how careers in outdoor activity are dominated by the male genders. And actually, when you look back, understanding the concept of how parks are designed and how that comes through. And that got me really intrigued and got me thinking about lots of other examples. So that's where I started. So I think we've got a great debate here to kind of go, do we start here? Do we start there? Or is it both? And is it about
Yeah.
gender? I don't know.
I I I think that those are all fantastic points, and I think we're right to question it. I think if we think about leadership, to me, one of the most important characteristics of a leader is to have that curiosity, to keep checking your biases and assumptions, and to really keep an open mind as you approach problems, situations, discussions. Um, because there's always more to learn, and this is a journey without end. And so I think that people may not necessarily identify themselves as leaders, but they may have a lot of these characteristics. And those are characteristics that can be nurtured. Whereas one of the pathways that I went down was, how do we know we're a leader? Um, I've always had this, I call it like an internal drive, but it is, and I think leadership is partly leading others, but most importantly, first and foremost, it's leading yourself, um, and finding more and better ways to do that as you go through your career. So I think that internal drive is an important one, and you see it even with kids in the playground, where there are certain children that take the lead, that will rush if someone's fallen down and hurt themselves and make sure they're okay. And I guess if I was looking to bring on people in leadership positions, those are some of the early characteristics that I would look for and some of the stories that I would hope to hear in an interview.
Yeah, amazing. I suppose that's interesting. So we're on the same wavelength around leadership. It's not actually about the
Yeah,
position. Eventually that's where it gets to. But then what
yeah,
happens? So that's really interesting because we both know our societies are very equal when it comes to gender. But yet
yeah,
our stats are saying in the hierarchy it's not happening. So it makes me curious as to what's happening at that younger age and all the way through that gets
yeah.
us there. And I was struck by a story my husband was telling me. My husband's a mechanical engineer. And he was brought up by an all-female family, his mum and his sister. So probably has had an interesting upbringing from that perspective. And he was telling me about a story. It's his story to share, really, but it struck me and it got me curious. So being in engineering, it's very male dominated at the moment, particularly in the world that he works in. He works in manufacturing, 24-hour plants, huge machinery. And he's really fortunate. I'd say fortunate because it creates lots of debate and that curiosity. He often comes home because he's got one of his managers, one of his leaders is female. And that's quite unusual in this world. And he came home the other week and said to me, I had this really interesting experience today. Can I chat to you about it? I was like, yeah, yeah, come on, what happened? He said, well, this female leader said, "Would you mind checking in on?" And I'm just going to use random names because it's that on Jean for me. And Jean was one of the operational team. They were just about to head into a manufacturing shutdown. So what happens in a manufacturing shutdown? All the operational team come out to help turn things off so it's safe, make it right. So that you're talking spanners and all that kind of stuff. And um, his manager had noticed something wasn't quite right, but hadn't had the chance to check in. He said, so she'd asked Jan, who's my husband, to go and check in and say, just check if Jean's all right. So he went to find Jean, and she was a bit down. And he was like, what's up? And Jean has only been in this operational role a couple of months, come from a different role, predominantly males in the other operational roles. And she just said to Jan, oh, I'm really struggling. I don't seem to be able to I don't seem to have the strength to be able to turn this off or turn something else on. And everyone else doesn't seem to be having problems. It's making me think about, can I carry on doing this role? And he said, well, come on, let's go for a walk. Show me, just show me. And when he went, he said, no wonder she was struggling. He said, they'd given her the wrong equipment for her body shape. So he said, like, straight away, with his engineering background, he's like, oh, let's sort that. Come on, let's go to the workshop. Straight away, put some extensions on the tools. Because he described to me, he said, what was going on was the males were using their brute strength, their force. But actually, there was a much easier way of doing it, which was about leverage. And it was all about the tools. So we get to the tools, ordered her some more to make sure she had all the right tools, but had enough to get going and do the job. Went and saw her a few days later, and she was just like, do you know what? That's made such a difference to my work. I'm enjoying it. I can do it. It's amazing. And it struck me that actually nobody would have noticed that. It took another female to notice something wasn't quite right. But actually, it took a male to go and work with her to understand what was going on. But she would have left that role if that hadn't have happened.
Mm.
And I was really struck that actually, do we end up with females coming out of roles and not heading to leadership? Because actually, we don't design the workspace or the tools for the work that they're doing. Just got me questioning about it.
That is such a powerful story, Kerry. And there's a couple of things to kind of unwrap there as well. And the first thing is not everybody would have noticed that the tools weren't right for her body shape. That in itself takes listening, observation. It takes experience as much as anything else. And then what was great about how the story ended was that actually doing it in the way that she's now doing it is better, it's quicker. So not only have the tools been customized to her needs, but she's now more efficient and more effective as a result. And I just want to pick up on something else there. So I used to work with the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. I was in charge of their leadership programs. And we had a very interesting discussion at one point, soon after I arrived. I'm an advocate for women in leadership programs because what I've noticed is that it creates, to your point about environment, it creates a slightly different environment. And this is not to detract from the wonderful training that we do with mixed groups, but women in leadership addresses itself specifically to some of the challenges that women face in the workplace. And our debate was around there's a use case for and against delivering that in engineering, because we know that there are more men than women engineers and that women are struggling with representation. If we put on a course for women leadership, for mechanical engineers, is that sending out a message that marginalizes men? Is it sending out a message to women that they need to be treated as a special case? And are we highlighting and overemphasizing the issue rather than looking to solve it? And then the other side of that argument, of course, that we know is women need help, especially in industries that are traditionally male dominated, like engineering. They need help to understand how to progress within that environment. And that's where I think these courses can be so valuable. So yeah, it was a discussion that was had for sure. Yeah.
How amazing that we've had totally different experiences in the similar worlds that go, oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. And I
Yeah.
think where it's leading me to start thinking about is it's the stuff that we don't notice that is possibly the norms that maybe can make the biggest difference. I'm a big fan. I don't know if you've read it about, oh, I won't shout, Caroline Criado's Invisible Women. Love her.
No.
So she talks about it. The book title is Invisible Women Exploring Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And I look back at my journey on this and think, until I'd read her work, I probably didn't notice a lot of stuff. It was just the norm. And how many of us don't notice stuff? I started thinking about, I don't know about you, but this is one of the things I do, and my husband noticed it and asked me about it. So when we're out, and if I'm on my own or with him, I do this. We park my car, go off and do what I've done. As we're heading towards the car, I take my keys out really early, way before I'm at my car. And
Yeah.
he started making fun of me. He said, like, you've got ages to go. Why have you got it out there? And actually, it was only reading and thinking about it that I realised why I did it. I didn't even consciously know I was doing it. But when I was brought up to think about my personal safety. And so
Yeah.
one of the things as a female that I was brought was in condition to do was always have your keys in your hand in case anyone does it for self-defense. And that sounds
Yeah.
really particularly now where the way cars are and you haven't really got proper car keys, you've got a fob, you don't
Yeah.
need it in that sense. But like I hadn't even noticed that I did that. And it got me then thinking about what are the other things that we don't notice? What about in environments where we work rotas, where women are partly working late? Do we think about the safety in car parks, the lighting? That study I was talking about how children use our parks, reading some fascinating stuff that the Friends of Rowntree Park do. They've been really thinking about how girls and boys use the environment, and they worked out that girls start feeling intimidated. They stop using the parks after the age of 8, much less than boys do, and what's around that. And they talked about design. So the things that they've talked about is better lighting, wider pathways, seating areas that face each other. So you have that connection and
Mm.
that community, wider entrances in and out of parks, safer
Mm.
toilet provision. And I was like, what that really got me thinking about is we often think about it, we're trying to fix a gender, and actually maybe it's not fixing the genders, it's fixing the environments. Because that's actually about the way they feel. It's about safety. So that's really got me interested in it. And, I do it without even recognizing it. And reading some stuff gets me there. I don't know. It's just struck me.
Yeah, no, I think these are all fascinating points, Kerry. And I think to your point about safety, I think that my mum ingrained it in me. I haven't got a daughter, I've got a son, but I ingrain it in my son. But I know with my sister's daughters who, they're mid-20s, safety is paramount, and they do exactly the same thing. And that same story has been passed on for generations and generations. And it is shocking that women are still having to, consciously or unconsciously, think about ways to protect themselves within our environment. Um, and as you said, a fascinating lens to look through this is rather than looking at, the men, the women, the gender gaps, to look at the environment and how that could be redesigned to accommodate both genders more equally. Yeah, it's fascinating. one of the things that I was also thinking about was, when I talked earlier on about how we've got the self leadership, we've got that drive, that internal drive that I think many leaders are aware of. They might not necessarily quantify it as a leadership behavior or capability, but they're aware that, if somebody needs to organize, a friend's outing or whatever, it's usually them. You tend to find that it's usually the same people. The same people are the ones that, a group of friends will feel safe coming to talk to about personal things, which they may not feel as comfortable. So there's those characteristics, there's the self-leadership piece, and then there's the piece around what organisations can do about all of this, because we've heard just a small sample of some of the data that's out there. I was reading something from 1992, and the reason that I caught onto this and that it fascinated me was it was a study done by a company called Eagly, and they and this was based more around, well, both science and psychology. And what they noticed is that women were more adept at displaying and therefore achieving transformational results within their teams than women. But where the women fell down, and I remember the 90s, and it was quite culturally, it was a very different time to now. But where the women fell down and lost their footing was when they started to replace their innate leadership skills and behaviours with what they thought was the male equivalent. And at that point, those percentages really started to drop off. People could not get behind women leaders who behaved like men. And I thought that was a really, really interesting piece of information. I'm not sure whether we see that as much anymore.
I don't know. You've struck on something that's been playing through my mind a lot lately is that actually, are we now in that era, and hopefully we are, where we think about authenticity much more and we
Yeah,
move forward with
yeah,
that. But what it's made me consider is, and this is gendered, but I don't think it's gendered as in anyone's got to approach it differently. It's how do we help each other understand the changing world. And so, we seem to be doing an awful lot around the programs about women in leadership, and I'm totally on, but obviously deliver on that, love it. I think it's a really important piece that we do. But my thinking of late has been thinking about how are we equipping men to step up to the changing environment? And there's and I've done it myself. I could flippantly say the world's designed around men. Men are in leadership everywhere, and I guess I'm not talking about that. I'm thinking about the kindness and compassion that you're describing, the curiosity. How do we develop that into our leadership thinking and equip each other? I've seen occasions where a man has misstepped with their language. They've not done it with intention. It wasn't meant
no,
like that. But it creates hurt, and I've seen the hurt. And sometimes, as a female, and I can think I've done this, I've gone quick to snap back at it. And actually, if I could approach that with curiosity and more have a conversation that goes, I'm really interested. When you said that, what were you trying to get across? Because this is what came across to me. And it makes me wonder whether we're now moving into a period where we should actually start about thinking about creating safe spaces for men to be able to have that conversation around how do we get the best out? Because I actually think, I like to think the best of people. I think there's good advocates
okay.
out there, and I think they want to get there, but they don't know how.
That's such a great point, Kerry. And I used to do a lot of work with men who were in very technical roles, obviously in engineering as well. I've worked in banking. And one of the things that I hear so often, and it's a really common theme. So this is not it's in part a generalization, but I hear it directly from men in those industries and in sales as well, that they've never been taught these skills. They want to understand how to bridge this awareness they have that there are many different aspects to us, but there are aspects that women have really doubled down on. So things like tuning into our instincts, our intuition a lot more, our emotional intelligence. And it's not that all women are born emotionally intelligent. That would be an awful way to approach this. It's more that women understand the benefits and they understand how important it is in and out of the workplace. So they make a choice to grow their self-awareness, to develop those different skills. And men have not been lucky enough to have necessarily been taught that at home. And many men that I come across in those industries feel really uncomfortable bringing it up that it's a skills gap for two reasons. First of all, because they're quite often in leadership positions where that's already expected. And if they have to own up to not having those human skills, they're worried that that might impact the way people see them. And also because for a lot of the men that I speak to, they don't know where to start. They don't know how to access these skills in a way that makes sense to them. I think women are a little bit guilty, I think, of assuming that because a lot of those skills are, we know about them as women. And I think it's very easy to assume that there's a one size fits all. But to your point from earlier, I think men, it would be helped by having courses that are for them specifically around these areas where they can not feel uncomfortable owning up in a mixed group that they have no clue how to assimilate those skills and how to deploy them to maximum effect.
We've gone all over, haven't we, today? That's
We
in such
have.
a short space of time. I look at it and think, oh, how amazing. I guess it's getting us to think about now. What we're describing is it equality or is it equity? Recognizing those differences that we've got. And it's back to your point where you started today, which is, isn't this all about curiosity? Actually, rather than rating judgments, let's explore it, let's debate it, which you know that we do on our programs anyway. That's part of it, isn't
Yeah,
it? And actually, there may be not one right place to start. There might be multiple places that we need to start. I think that's what's
yeah.
coming across to me today.